Go. All right. This evening, we have Tiffany Jones joining us from FCPS. Tiffany is a licensed professional counselor and a certified substance abuse counselor in the Commonwealth of Virginia. She received both her bachelor's in psychology and her master's in counseling from George Mason University. Prior to working for FCPS as a substance abuse prevention specialist, or SAPS, for 4 years, she's now a senior substance abuse prevention specialist. She used to also work for numerous government agencies, including the Virginia Department of Corrections, serving as the district mental health clinician in 3 probation offices, Prince William County's Community Service Board as a substance abuse therapist, and for the Marine Corps as a substance abuse therapist. And in her time off, which she surely deserves and hopefully gets to take, she enjoys eating good food from various cultures, meeting with her supper club, running for enjoyment and competitively, and traveling. But most of all, I certainly know her from all of her work that she's done as a substance abuse prevention specialist, and I'm delighted to have Tiffany join us today. Tiffany, you want to talk a little bit about how this sort of came to be, and just I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Michelle, for the intro. Hopefully you all can see me on this fancy, snazzy background. Can you see the PowerPoint as the background and me on top of the PowerPoint?
But wild, yes, indeed.
Yes. Okay, perfect. So I'll just start with the presentation because I think that will answer the questions for you, Michelle. So
okay. And I'm going to actually ask you the 2 questions that we always get asked.
okay.
One is, do you want people to interrupt you with questions, put them in the chat, or save them for the end?
So I have a slide built in close to halfway in the middle of the presentation that says questions on it. So about halfway through, you all can either cut your mic on or drop your questions in the chat, and I'll answer questions, and then we'll do another Q&A at the end. I just ask that when we do the questions in the middle, if you specifically focus on the information that I've already shared, because I more than likely will answer your question for the second half.
Wonderful. And then people usually also ask if you will share your slides.
So as a program, we don't share our slides, but since this is video recorded, I believe that you all will have the link up on YouTube that you can reference.
Exactly. That is exactly what I thought we were going to do. All right. So let's run with it. Thank you. All
right, so thank you all for attending. I am the Senior Substance Abuse Prevention Specialist for FCPS. With our program, we have substance abuse prevention specialists that provide services to every high school pyramid. So what that means is the office for the SAPS is based out of the high school, but they provide education and intervention services to the feeder elementary and middle school students. So every single school has a SAPS. For our time today, we're going to go over some basic information about alcohol, nicotine, cannabis, and opioids. But for you all, I have created a special presentation where we are going to focus on medication safety practices, drug interactions, drug misuse risk factors. A lot of our information is going to focus on ADHD because ADHD is a very prevalent diagnosis. And then we'll look at some mental health diagnoses and substance use disorder. So anytime you see SUD on my slides, that means substance use disorder. And then we'll talk about prevention and coping as well. So I have already talked about our SAPS program, but what I really want you to remember is that we have been here since 2018. We've been doing the work since 2018. So don't let anyone say, you know, the FCPS doesn't have a robust program, because we do. And we've been doing the work for almost 5 years now. And I've been here since the inception of the program. So let's start with a drug bedroom. So in the comments, I want you all to point out some of the drug paraphernalia that you see in this simulated bedroom. the 420 socks, the prescription bottle. What else do you all see? The sour diesel poster, the Lysol could be a thing. Yep. Molly referenced the foil. Very good. Anything else? The pacifier, the Sprite bottle with the Jolly Ranchers. Very good. So here's what we have. So you all already, I'm not going to mention well, actually, I'm going to go through all of them so that you can understand what they are related to. So you see the sour diesel poster, that is related to a strain of marijuana. You see the Houston styrofoam cup with the purple in the background on the pillow, on the bed. That references lean or scissor, which is codeine mixed with Sprite, mixed with Jolly Ranchers. Then you see the 420 socks, April 20th just passed, also known as a smoker's holiday. I don't necessarily believe that kids pay attention too much to 420 anymore because kids will smoke whenever they want to smoke, but it's really an old reference and it's good for you all to understand. Then you see the tampons on the dresser. I haven't heard too much of our students doing this, but some young people do. They will take a tampon, soak it in alcohol, insert the tampon vaginally, and then the alcohol is absorbed through the body that way. You'll see the plastic cup, which is often used for alcoholic beverages, the Girl Scout cookie sweatshirt, which is a strain of marijuana as well. My body is covering the backpack. There you go. You see the backwoods on the backpack. And then on the backpack as well, there we go, an emoji, which could signify that a student is the plug. The plug means that they sell drugs, that they are a dealer. You see the 710 on the notebook. Let me see. You see the 710 on the notebook on the desk, which is oil upside down, like THC oil. The prescription bottle, the onion on the laptop could reference the dark web, which could be a means that they are purchasing drugs. You see the vape pen on the desk as well, the Sprite bottle to make the codeine, the lean, next to the Jolly Ranchers, Perk 30 on the jersey. The Lysol spray could be used to cover up the smell. And if it's an aerosol can, that can be used for huffing. The pacifier on the hat is really an old reference, but pacifiers, the candy pacifiers are predominantly used in like raves when people use ecstasy or MDMA because their jaws and teeth will kind of clench and grind uncontrollably. And then the foil, which has been found on students lately, foil, a rolled up dollar bill, or like a burnt spoon or anything like that could signify that someone is smoking Percocets. So this is another question for you all. What are the top 3 most widely used substances by youth in Fairfax County? Drop your top 3 or one of the 3 in the comments. Someone said marijuana. So 1 cannabis, 1 alcohol. Let me get 1 more. I love it when someone says opioids. I love it when someone says opioids, although that is an incorrect answer, because it shows you how some things are hyped up in the media. While I understand that we are in a current opioid epidemic and a lot of people are overdosing and there are a lot more, there are a lot of non-fatal overdoses, and then there are also fatal overdoses. Opioids are not one of the top substances that our kids are using. The top substances that our kids are using remain cannabis, which would be marijuana, but cannabis, nicotine, and alcohol. Opioids is actually the least often used drugs by our students. So this is a video that I will show you all. Let me stop sharing this screen for a second and I'll pull up the video. This is just a little background. This is called the Nuggets video that is super popular. The little bird that you see on the screen is a kiwi bird that is apparently native to Australia, and that bird is not supposed to fly. So 1 second while All right, so you all just watched that video. That's a video that we show to students quite often. The reason why I wanted to show you that video was because it starts off as the Kiwi minding its own business, and then it kind of plays with the nugget, which could represent drug use. And then over time, you just see that his symptoms get worse over time. His physical body begins to change. I'm using a him pronoun, but his physical body begins to change over time. His environment changes as well. And then you just notice that even like from the beginning, he flew high, right? Remember, the bird was never supposed to fly. When we use drugs and when people use substances, their body kind of surpasses the set point of the natural high that we're supposed to feel. So the things that are supposed to make us feel our highest would be food and sex. But when you do things such as using drugs, if food and sex gets us here, drugs is going to get us here. So the Kiwi bird flew really high and he was like, oh, wow, that feels amazing. But when he comes down, the first time there were no consequences. So he lands on his feet. But as he continues to use, he doesn't even get high anymore. So I encourage you to reframe the way that you think about drug users habitually using despite the negative consequences in their life. And it's not that drug users continue to use because they just want to get high, or why can't you see that it's affecting other people? Why can't you see that it's affecting your grades? Sometimes they can see it, but most of the time for people who are addicted or they meet like a clinical level of a diagnosis, they're no longer using to get high. They are using to avoid the symptoms of withdrawal. So they are simply avoiding the negativity that comes with being sober or being abstinent from drugs, because they have been using so long that their body has adjusted to the drug being in their system that the body no longer makes those natural feel-good chemicals. So the body is now relying on those substances. And we'll dive into that a little bit deeper when we look at opioids in particular. So give me 1 second and I'll set up my background again for you all. All right. Let me move my body over here. There we go. So you'll see that the Kiwi started with experimental use. He moved over to the mild range, moderate, and then severe. So even when someone receives a diagnosis of having a substance use disorder, it moves through categories of mild, moderate, and severe. It's not a yes, you are addicted or no, you're not addicted. All it takes is about 2 symptoms for someone to meet criteria for having a substance use disorder with, of course, some additional parameters in there. So now when we think and when we talk about drug use and how someone can become a problematic user, it's important to remember the biology and genes and also the environment. I know when you look at this image, it looks a little bit overwhelming, but I just want you to think of nature and nurture. They're both important. So it's important for you to have conversations with the young person in your life about what's floating around in that gene pool. If you have a parent or if one of their parents had an addiction history, then it's important for you to talk to your child about that. It doesn't matter what you or the other person was addicted to, because case in point, my dad really likes butter pecan ice cream. I'm not a fan of butter pecan ice cream, but I truly, and I do mean truly, love Trader Joe's cookie butter ice cream. So it doesn't matter the flavor of the drug, because a drug is a drug is a drug. All that matters is that addiction floats around in that gene pool, and it makes someone susceptible to becoming addicted later on in life if they then begin to put the drug in their body. So once someone puts the drug in their body, depending on the route of administration, how strong the drug is, how young the person is when they begin to use drugs, it can begin to change the way that the brain functions, which could lead to addiction or a substance use disorder. So when it comes to alcohol, it is extremely important for you all as adults to be mindful of the conversations that you have. When we meet with students as SAPS, we ask them about their history of drug use. And oftentimes when we talk to them about their drug use, it's not necessarily, just the common drugs that we're looking for. But when it comes time for them to talk about alcohol, they are usually talking about the fact that their parents gave them alcohol. And it's not usually just like, oh, my parent provided alcohol at a party, like, for a party for me and my friends. That's the obvious. Parents generally know that they shouldn't do that, but it's those somewhat or seemingly innocuous, like under the radar sharing of alcohol. So it's sharing it during New Year's Eve, during the Christmas holiday, and things like that. So let me share this video with you.
You should not smoke pot with your kids. You wanting to smoke pot with your kids is basically a way of you justifying your pot use. But it's important for you not to do that because you don't want to teach your kids bad habits, but you also don't want to interfere with the development of their brain. We know that the adolescent, the teenage brain is going through profound changes, and that the brain really doesn't solidify until around the age of 22. We know that the child's brain is developing from the back of the brain, which rules their impulses and emotions, and anybody who lives with a teenager knows that that is in full force during teenage and adolescent years, into the front part of the brain, which rules logic. And we want our kids to develop the capacity to make logical, non-impulsive decisions. When you put marijuana into that brain, it interferes with the capacity for the front part of the brain, the logical part of the brain, to develop appropriately. So you're going to have kids who are going to have delayed emotional, psychological responses to the world around them, and they're going to continue to act out in the world in unhealthy ways. So again, it's important for you not to smoke marijuana with your kids because, again, the brain of your children is developing. It's not fully developed until they're around the age of 22 years old. It's going to have negative physiological and psychological impact on them, and you're sending out a message to your kids that changing their emotions by substances is okay. And our children need to develop the capacity to handle their uncomfortable emotions in healthy, constructive ways, not through drugs and alcohol.
All right, so he was primarily talking about marijuana there, but it still fits for alcohol, right? So you don't want to use substances with your child because the thing about children is when you give them an inch, they will literally take a mile from it. Their assumption is, oh, well, my mom said that she can't necessarily stop me from using drugs. So as long as I do it at home, it's fine. But in a child's mind, that they understand that as it's okay for me to use drugs because my mom is okay with it. They're going to shorten and simplify it. So you have to be very clear about your boundaries and expectations with your child because they will twist it and turn it into whatever they want it to be. My bio was read at the beginning, and I'll often joke and say that at times kids can be baby criminals because they will twist things up to make it fit, whatever they want it to fit. So you need to be mindful of that. So next, another thing that I want you to be mindful of is your language that you use around IEP meetings and alcohol. So these were some memes that I pulled from the internet, and one says IEP meeting tomorrow. I have a flask, a shiv, voodoo dolls, poison blow darts, truth serum, and a vial of holy water. Am I missing anything? So when we talk about alcohol, and when we talk about, the stress that's in our life, it's important not to pair those two together. Most often I see this, and it was heavy during the height of the pandemic in 2020, where people were talking about their alcohol use, and they were like, "Woo, I just had my alcohol and I put my wine in my coffee mug. So when I'm on my Zoom meetings, I could just sip out of my mug and people don't know that I'm drinking." Or when someone is stressed and they come home from work and they say, "Ooh, I could really use a glass of wine. Today has been a doozy," right? What that says is that I need something outside of my body. I need a mood altering substance to bring me down. I need something else to calm me. I'm about to enter into this IEP meeting. I know that this IEP meeting is going to get on my nerves. So I really need a glass of wine. I really need a drink, right? And then there's one related to teachers. If teachers had IEPs on the job, if teachers had IEPs on the job, drinking would be part of our accommodations and required by law. So this is some of the talk that's happening around special education, IEPs, and alcohol, right? So now let's dive into nicotine and ADHD. So we find that since nicotine is a stimulant drug, and oftentimes ADHD is treated with stimulant medications, kids who have ADHD will gravitate towards nicotine. Okay, so there are higher rates of nicotine use and vaping in students with ADHD versus students who do not have ADHD. And then there are also comorbidities, meaning that the two diagnoses exist. So when someone has a conduct disorder and also a severe mood dysregulation, meaning like depression and anxiety, this increases their risk for having a substance use disorder, especially when they have ADHD. Okay, so a prior diagnosis does increase the risk for substance use disorder. Now, when we look at cannabis, cannabis is the umbrella term. Cannabis, you all might refer to it as weed or pot, but the active ingredient in cannabis is THC, and THC is the ingredient that gets you high, whereas CBD is non-impairing and does not typically cause a high. And I say does not typically cause a high because most of the time the strains that are out in the market now have a certain percentage of THC, then a certain percentage of CBD. Most of the time there is a hybrid. So it really just depends on the effect that people want from their marijuana that determines the concentration of the THC versus the CBD. Oh, whoops, actually, let me go back. The picture on this slide shows a iPhone charger that's been stripped. And the SRO, when he found that cord, and this was years ago, it's happening even more now. What's happening is kids are stripping the cord and they're using it to charge their vape device. But unfortunately, because the cord is stripped and kind of jerry-rigged to charge the device, the kids are getting a unregulated hit of the cannabis that they're vaping or the nicotine that they're vaping. So it might be a more concentrated hit than they're accustomed to. When it comes to cannabis, the routes of administration vary. So sometimes people are smoking joints, blunts, or using bongs or vapes. Most of our kids are using vape devices, bongs, and then edibles. Usually when we get like hearings office cases, I see younger kids using edibles, but that does not mean that the high school kids don't use it. And then when it comes to joints like the flower marijuana, The few times that I have kids that use the flower marijuana is because they are actually trying to cut back on their marijuana use, because edibles and vape devices are going to be more potent, whereas the dried flowers and the joints are less potent. So usually the kids are trying to wean themselves off of marijuana completely by switching to joints, or they're simply trying to cut back a little bit, but they want to keep using. When kids go to the hospital for using cannabis, it's usually because they are vaping and because they're using edibles because of the potency. And due to edibles, you just eating it and consuming it, kids don't know that, hey, when you eat this edible, you're only supposed to take a bite of the cookie. You're not supposed to eat the entire cookie. And then they get a more potent dose. So cannabis and the brain, cannabis specifically affects the portion of the brain that's responsible for memory and learning, which is the hippocampus, and the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that processes emotions. The thing about smoking cannabis is that THC, that active ingredient in cannabis, impacts ADHD meds. It lessens the impact of ADHD medication. Usually medicinal THC is usually 1 to 2 puffs of a joint. And it usually has a higher concentration of CBD. So when you hear young people talking about, oh, well, I'm using this because it helps with my ADHD or it helps with my anxiety, it's usually just 1 to 2 puffs, and it's a higher concentration of the CBD, not the THC. So a lot of times they're literally just blowing smoke. I use that term when someone is just, lying, trying to pacify you. They're just blowing smoke to continue to be able to use so that people will leave them alone about their drug use. So drug interactions are really important when we're talking about someone being on mental health medications, because again, cannabis decreases the effectiveness of ADHD meds, and that could lead to a strain on the heart, because cannabis, it's this weird drug where it doesn't necessarily fall under any type of specific category. And I think it's because of the different hybrids and mixes that are out there. But cannabis does increase the heart rate, and so does stimulant medications such as ADHD medications. So using both of them over time can put a strain on the heart. And cannabis now has a higher concentration than it did decades ago. Decades ago, the percentage of THC that was in cannabis was about like 3% in the 60s and 70s. And now we're looking at dab pens, the vape pens that have upwards of 80 to 90% THC concentration. So that's like going from a light beer to Everclear. So when we talk about these high concentrations, it's increasing young people's chances for developing mental health issues later on in life, especially if they already have those genes floating around for mental health issues in their family. And then regular use could lead to a loss of 8 IQ points. I don't want you to take that and conflate it, because what the research has shown is that it affects IQ when someone uses a extremely potent amount on a regular basis. So when people are frequent users and they're using that high amount regularly is when it has been linked to a loss of IQ points. So now let's look at a medicine cabinet and some things that you all have at home that could be abused by young people. So in the top right, top left, you'll see a prescription bottle. I just want you to be mindful of any prescriptions that you keep laying around your house, and think about why you're keeping it if you no longer use it. This past Saturday, there was the DEA's Drug Take Back Day. Fairfax County Police have like drop sites where people can come and drop off their old medications. no questions asked. And even outside of Drug Take Back Day, the police stations have a box where you can go and dispose of your medications. You just walk in, the box is there, dump it, and roll out. Then on the right, you'll see Robitussin, which is a cough medicine. When used in high doses, it can cause hallucinations. Kids call this robo-tripping or skittling. Usually it takes a lot in order to feel it. Let's look at like the capsules. For capsules, in order to feel like the highest, I guess, hallucinations is usually 18 to 33 capsules. And then when it comes to the syrup, it's about 185 to 375 milliliters. But you can get a little bit of a buzz if you simply take 4 to 6 capsules and 35 to 60 milliliters of the syrup. The young person will begin to feel restless, and they'll begin to feel euphoria just off of those 4 to 6 capsules. And then when it comes to Imodium, which is typically used for like when someone has the bubble guts or that gastrointestinal distress, you can get an opioid-like high if you take 200 to 300 milligrams. And for consideration, 2 tablets is usually the recommended dose, and 2 tablets is 4 milligrams. So it does take a whole lot. Something to be mindful of is a lot of times some of these medications can simply be purchased at the Dollar Tree. And we know that young people are broke. They do not have money, so if they could go into the Dollar Tree and either buy it or steal it, then they will get their hands on it and use it by any means. Mucinex can be abused. It can cause hallucinations with as little as 300 milligram dose. And then NyQuil can be abused because remember, about 10% of, there's about 10% of alcohol in NyQuil. So even when someone is in substance abuse recovery, we tell them, hey, you need to be mindful of the medications that you use. Make sure that you're using alcohol-free medications. Sudafed is also known as poor man's speed because it does have a stimulant effect, and it's also an ingredient that's used to make meth. Benadryl increases the high of alcohol and narcotics, and we all know that Benadryl will put you down and make you feel sleepy. And then, of course, you know, anyone can use rubbing alcohol if they want to drink. So any questions thus far? You can drop them in the chat or, yeah, probably just drop them in the chat because I think everyone's mic is disabled. I'll keep going. If questions pop up, I'll start to answer them. So now let's dive into opioids for a bit. So opioids are prescription and non-prescription pain relievers. And by non-prescription, I do not mean over-the-counter pain medication, but I mean heroin, the street drug. So the thing about opioids is that they are depressant medications, depressant not meaning that they put you into a depressed mood or state, but they slow down, they depress your central nervous system. Your central nervous system is responsible for breathing and your heart rate. So when someone abuses opioids or uses opioids, it slows down their breathing and it slows down their heart rate. The thing about opioids to consider is that opioids, because they are prescribed for pain and the brain does not, I can hear the translation, but because the brain cannot distinguish the difference between physical pain and emotional pain, when someone uses opioids, it works for all types of pain. It works for physical pain, it works for emotional pain.
I'm working on it, Tiffany. Sorry. Thanks.
That's okay. Now, opioids, when someone misuses them, we're looking for the 3 C's, which would be loss of control, craving or preoccupation with use, and use despite negative consequences. The thing about having a true problem with drugs in general is that your life revolves around using the substance, withdrawing from the substance, or constantly thinking about getting your next high, fix, buzz, or alleviating your withdrawal symptoms. That's their life as a whole, right? So they have lost control. They have attempted to set parameters around when and how they're going to use drugs, but they can't. They're constantly thinking about it, craving it, and they continue to use despite, the negativity that it comes with. When someone is intoxicated with an opioid, they are under the influence of the opioid. So they will experience bradycardia, which is a slowed heart rate, a reduced level of consciousness. So this is what happens when it's kind of hard to wake them up. They will have pinpoint pupils. That's usually a classic sign of opioid use, because with opioids, they're unique because it causes that pinpoint pupils, whereas with other drugs, their pupils are usually dilated. They will have a depressed respiratory rate, so their breathing becomes a little bit more shallow and slowed. Hypotension, meaning low blood pressure. Blue skin, blue, cold, and clammy skin, especially when they have overdose. And then hypothermia, meaning their body temperature is cold. Opioid withdrawal symptoms look like craving the drug, of course, a little bit of anxiety, restlessness, gastrointestinal distress. That is a very nice way of putting what they're actually going through, because opioids are depressant and it slows everything down in the body. When someone is withdrawing from the drug, meaning the drug is wearing off, or the drug is no longer in their system, their body is opening up. So when someone is using opioids, they usually don't have bowel movements regularly anymore. But when they begin to withdraw, they begin to have frequent, somewhat uncontrollable bowel movements. Their eyes are running. Basically, everything is coming out of every opening in their body. They might be vomiting, diarrhea, frequent urination, cold sweats and chills, and then of course the irregular heart rate. Those who are most at risk of overdosing would be those who have a prior overdose history. It's been said that the more that someone has a non-fatal overdose, it increases their chances of having a fatal overdose in the future. And when there's changes in tolerance, so when someone goes from rehab or jail per se, they may not have been using substances, and then they get out and they attempt to use the same amount that they were using prior to incarceration or before treatment, and then they overdose because their body can't handle that level of the substance anymore. When there's a change in quality or purity, or they're buying drugs off of the street, because the DEA has shown that because the DEA has shown that upwards of like 6 to, I think it's maybe 8 now, but upwards of 6 to 8 out of 10 pills that are confiscated from the street are mixed with fentanyl. So speaking of fentanyl, in the picture that you see on the right, you'll see a 2-inch glass vial of heroin, and then the same for fentanyl. A potentially lethal amount or dose of fentanyl is about 2 milligrams. And then you'll see in the vial on the left, that is a potentially lethal dose of heroin. So it does not take much to potentially kill someone with fentanyl. Mixing drugs is particularly dangerous because opioids are a depressant drug. When you mix them with other depressant medications, it has a synergistic effect. So it's no longer a 1 + 1 = 2. This depressant plus this depressant is, fine and okay to use. it's this depressant plus this depressant heightens the effect of both that they would usually be on their own. And that could cause an overdose as well. So other depressant drugs would be any type of benzodiazepine, usually anxiety medications, such as Valium, Ativan, Klonopin, Xanax, any type of muscle relaxant or any type of sedative hypnotic. Alcohol is a depressant medication. So that's what you should be mindful of when it comes to risk for overdose. Someone who has a weakened immune system, such as HIV, any type of liver disease or heart issues, and then of course, IV drug users. Fentanyl is up to 50 times stronger than heroin and up to 100 times stronger than morphine. Here it is. The DEA lab has found that of the fentanyl-laced fake prescription pills analyzed in 2022, 6 out of 10 contain a potentially lethal dose of fentanyl. Overdose signs and symptoms for you to consider, of course, would be unconscious or not responding. And for an overdose, you are looking for, they are not responding. You are shaking them, you are calling their name while shaking them, and they are non-responsive. Because when someone uses opioids and it slows down the breathing, most of the time when someone is under the influence, it will look as if they are sleeping. They'll have what we call like a heroin nod or an opioid nod, where they just kind of go in and out of looking like they're falling asleep. But when someone has overdosed, they are non-responsive to your attempts to wake them. And then we've already talked about some of these other signs and symptoms already. So Narcan is the only thing that can reverse an opioid overdose. Narcan is the brand name, naloxone is the generic name. If you use Narcan or administer Narcan, which is usually administered via a nasal spray, it will not harm someone when they do not have an opioid in their body. And by that same token, when someone says, oh, I didn't use any opioids, but the Narcan revived them, then there was opioids in their system. So either the cocaine or whatever other pill they claim they used had an opioid in it. It is non-habit forming, so you don't have to worry about any type of abuse potential. And it's still important to call 911 after Narcan has been administered because the opioid is still floating around in the body. So this is a short clip that I'm not going to show you, but I just want to highlight the fact that every FCPS school has Narcan in the building. That is Narcan in elementary, middle, and high schools. Every school is well stocked, and the SAPS contacts the building personnel monthly to make sure that they have their full supply. The people who are trained in schools that are allowed to administer the Narcan at this moment would be the admin staff, the principals, APs, the DSS. They're all trained, the security, the clinic staff, the SROs, of course, and they have their own Narcan that they carry, and then the SAPS. FCPS is currently working on policies to get teachers and other people who want to take the training trained, and then they're working on policies regarding students. That is all still in the works. That is not in effect as of now. So let's look at substance use disorder and ADHD. About 6 to 9% of 8 to 15-year-olds have a diagnosis of ADHD or meet criteria for ADHD. And then only about 4 to 5% of 18 to 44-year-olds have ADHD. The USA has a high prevalence of ADHD in comparison to other countries. So we'll talk about a little bit of that later. But about 50 to 60% of teens that have a substance use disorder also have ADHD. So there is a high correlation or comorbidity between those two diagnoses. When someone has a more severe substance use history, it makes it more difficult for them to enter into remission of substance use disorder. And we use the word remission in substance use treatment because when someone has an addiction, it has been said that they will have the addiction for life. It's just a matter of if they are actively using or not, or if they're in remission or not. So similar to cancer, we need to screen and be mindful of the symptoms, right? And then when you think about people who have ADHD and a substance use disorder, they usually don't stay in treatment as long, which increases the likelihood that they will continue to have drug problems later on in life. And then about 25 to 50% of people with ADHD also experience sleep disturbances. So sometimes they might be using drugs as a means to cope and go to sleep. So we know that young people, they have a hard time regulating their emotions. Emotional self-talk is very common with people who have ADHD. They have more anxious thought processes. They tend to be more prevalent than others. They tend to overthink things and spiral. Because the thing about us as general and then with anxious and hyper people is that our strengths whisper while our weaknesses scream. So if my weaknesses are screaming at me and my thoughts are constantly moving so fast and I'm always overthinking, it makes sense to use a drug to attempt to calm my mind and calm my emotions. Because remember, marijuana affects the amygdala in our brain, and the amygdala is responsible for processing emotions. So if my emotions are always heightened, it makes sense for me to use something outside of my body to temper my emotions because my body has betrayed me and will not regulate itself. And then when we look at autism, people with autism are less likely to drink and use drugs, but when they use, they're usually at a higher risk for developing a substance use disorder. And typically we'll find that people with autism use because they are looking for that routine, and drug use comes with the routine and repetitiveness. They usually lack suitable supports. They also don't know how to manage their emotions, or they received a late diagnosis of autism. And then they might also have a co-occurring physical and mental health condition. So substance use disorder and ADHD treatment. So because ADHD meds are a stimulant medication, and stimulant medications do have an abuse potential, sometimes people say that when someone has a substance use disorder, they should not receive stimulant medication for their ADHD. But the research actually shows that when you medicate children, especially prior to the age of 9, when they have ADHD, it usually reduces their risk of developing a substance use disorder pretty significantly. So if your child has ADHD, they're young, you want to give them medications at the doctor's recommendation because that can reduce their chances of having a substance use disorder. Because if you don't treat the underlying mental health condition, it could lead to the substance use disorder, which we already know is a risk factor. So the picture on your screen, you'll see the brain. You see 5-year, preteen, teen, and 20-year. So the brain is about fully developed around the age of 25. The front portion of the brain, known as the frontal lobe, is responsible for that higher processing. So when you look at your teenager and you're like, what you're doing makes absolutely no sense. What are you doing? Like, you're cursing in your hair, trying to figure out, like, what is this child of mine doing? You just have to remember their brain is not developed. It is not fully developed, right? And when you mix in drugs with that, it slows down the rate of maturation even further. So a lot of times when I work with adults, we do this biopsychosocial assessment. We're figuring out how old they were when they tried every single substance that they've ever used in their life. And when I talk to adults and they tell me, oh, I've been using drugs since the age of 10, right? I started using marijuana at 10. And I began using regularly at 13. When I'm talking to that 40-year-old, I'm thinking to myself as a clinician, okay, so that means that every interaction that we have from here on out, you are more than likely processing it as a 10 or 13-year-old, because every interaction that you've had in your life has also involved that substance. The substance has been a shield to process every life event. So they don't know how to handle things as an adult anymore. Immediate release ADHD meds are usually the ones that have a higher abuse potential. Usually the ADHD meds that have a extended release aren't abused as much because they want the high and they want it now. So the immediate release medications give them that buzz when they abuse it. The top 3 reasons for stimulant misuse would be helping with concentration, attempting to stay awake, and then, of course, reducing distractions. So we find that the rates of misuse are highest in schools that, of course, have students with high ADHD rates. So the higher the number of ADHD diagnoses in school buildings, the higher the rate of misuse. Usually it's college students who will misuse it the most. And then about 55% of misusers will ingest the pill, meaning they will take it orally. And then 40% who misuse it will snort it. Prescription stimulant misuse is linked with cocaine and meth use later on in life as well, because they're all stimulant medications. Some of the ways that you can limit the stimulant misuse would be, of course, to limit the supply. Boys are more likely to purchase medications from other people, whereas girls are more likely to overuse their own medications. So when you think about having those ADHD medications in the home, you want to consider, am I administering this medication or am I allowing my child to keep their large supply of stimulant medications in their bedroom? And then when the doctor prescribes the medication, how many pills are they sending you home with? Are they sending you home with a 30-day supply, a 60-day, or a 90? That's a lot of pills to just keep in the house. And then you also want to educate the young person about not advertising to their friends that they have these drugs, right? Because if they advertise, hey, yeah, I'm on ADHD meds, that increases the chances for other young people to come up and say, hey, can I get some of those? Can I borrow some of those? And then be mindful of where you store those meds as well. These are some reminders for you all to consider for kids that have ADHD. When they are experiencing overthinking, they should write, because writing slows down your thinking. When they're anxious, they should meditate. When they're tired, they should take a power nap. I took a beautiful nap today because this week is extremely busy for me and I needed that nap. And I feel amazing now. When they're sad, they should exercise so they could get the natural feel-good chemicals. When they're stressed, they can walk. When they're angry, they can listen to music. When they're feeling lazy, they should reduce their screen time, because our kids have extremely high screen times. When I do classroom lessons on addiction and drugs, I always have the kids pull up their iPhone and check their screen time for me. The highest that I've heard was, I think, 13 hours per day. The lowest that I've heard was 2 hours. The norm usually sits around 7 hours of screen time per day. That is a lot of screen time. And it's no wonder that our kids are anxious, because they are constantly infiltrated with ads and scrolling, looking for their next dopamine fix on TikTok. And then when they're burnt out, they should read. So some prevention strategies for you all to consider would be taking the information that you learned today and having conversations with your child. You want to have frequent small talks. You're not just having one big talk and like, okay, that's it, I've done my job as a parent. No, you want to mix it in with normal conversations. So when you're at the dinner table, you want to have these conversations. So it's a little late now. Hopefully you all have had dinner. So tomorrow you'll have dinner, maybe with your child at the table, and you'll say, I attended this presentation with this crazy lady, and she was talking about drug use. And she said this, this, and this. Like, what are your thoughts? Or pass the salt. I was just thinking, blah, blah, blah. Did you hear about this thing that happened on the news about this kid overdosing at this school? Like, what are your thoughts? What do you think your response would be if you found a kid that overdosed in the bathroom? Right? So have those conversations. Lock up your medications, treat your medications like a loaded gun. You know that there's an abuse potential with medications. You might know that you have a history of addiction in your family, so treat them like a loaded gun and lock them up. You could get med lock boxes from the Fairfax Falls Church CSB. I will have a link of resources for you all, so do not worry about that. And then something that I want you to consider when it comes to prevention is that, remember in the beginning when I asked, like, what are the top 3 drugs that FCPS students use? And every single time we have these type of sessions, someone says opioids. And it's not opioids, but at the same time, when we talk about drug use as adults, we tend to highlight the bad behavior. So we'll say, 10% of kids are using marijuana regularly. What are we going to do about that? What are the schools doing about all the vaping in the bathrooms? But the majority of kids don't. And of the majority of the kids that don't use marijuana, of the 97% of kids that don't abuse opioids, because less than 3% use opioids, of the 90%, what do they have in common? They have parents or guardians who are available to help. They participate in after-school activities. They have adults in the community to talk to. They accept responsibility and have high personal integrity for their own actions. They have teachers who recognize and praise their good efforts. They're connected. They're connected to other people. They're connected back to themselves with their high integrity. So when we look at what does it take to protect my child from having a drug problem, it takes connection. It takes the thing that our society doesn't gravitate towards anymore because we're all doing our own things separately. We barely know our neighbor's name. We all try to mind our business, but connection is what saves people from depression, from drug use, from anxiety, from suicidal thoughts. The answer is the same for all of it. So with that, it isn't the drug that causes the harmful behavior, it's the environment. An isolated rat will almost always become an addict. A rat with a good life almost never will, no matter how many drugs you make available to him. As Bruce put it, this was in a study. He was realizing that addiction isn't a disease, addiction is an adaptation. It's not you, it's the cage you live in. So this quote is from Johann Hari, who has phenomenal writings about addiction and drug use. And there was a study that put rats in a cage. One rat had a lot of stimulating activities that it could do. It had a wheel, it had all of these things. Then another rat simply had a cage where when he pressed the lever, it administered cocaine. The rat that didn't have anything going on in its life, wasn't connected to other little baby rats to play with, constantly administered the cocaine. The rat that had the wheel and all of like the rat amusement park, it simply enjoyed the amusement park. It wasn't trying to use the cocaine. So we will all look for something to fill our cup, but it's a matter of what do I have access to that makes me feel whole and complete and connected. So it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a sick society, because right now we're living in a pretty sick society. So when someone uses substances, they're simply trying to feel better. They're trying to manage living in this sick society. So when you have conversations with young people, pretty please do not use scare tactics. Do not say if you use drugs, you're going to become addicted, you're going to go to jail and you're going to die. Because for the vast majority of people who who attempt to use drugs or who use drugs, they will not become addicted. Only 10% will become addicted. But of that 10%, they usually had a lot of risk factors. There was some parental separation and divorce. There was abuse. There was a neglect. There was living in a household with someone who has a mental health diagnosis. There was someone, a parent, a family member who went to jail or prison. They had all of these adversities that they experienced of that 10% that became addicted. Also, be mindful of the stories that you tell about how you used to use drugs, because remember, the drugs that you may have used in the past are not the same drugs that they're using now. So continue to have those open, frequent conversations. Remain calm. Let them be the expert, because trust me, they know way more about drugs than you do. They do. And when you establish that open relationship, it makes it easier. It's not a you versus them. So again, when you have these conversations, I want you to take a social norms approach. So I want you to highlight the kids that are not using drugs, right? So highlight the things that they're doing, because adults and youth tend to overestimate the other kid. They tend to overestimate the number of youth who use substances. And then when non-users learn they are part of the majority and they're not alone in their opposition to use, they can be more confident in speaking out. They can be more confident in not acting as bystanders. They're going to be an active bystander who discourages use amongst others. So coping is all of those good things that make us feel good, the things that give us that natural high, right? Physical activity, nature, listening to music, self-care, church, anything that makes them feel good naturally. And then these are just some local resources, but when you all, and national resources, but when you all scan this QR code, it's going to take you to a survey that I created. And then once you complete the survey and you enter your email address, you'll get the PDF, or you can just email me with the email address that's up there. It's 2 J's and the number 1. So if you all have any questions, now is the time. While I wait for you all to chat or turn your mics on, I'll review what's already in the chat box. All right, so I'll start with the first one that says, I used to work at a hospital, and one day a patient in withdrawal was in a room next to my desk. Listening to him all day was horrifying. It's painful. They talk about their bones hurting. It is painful to go through withdrawal. So when you think about someone using substances, it's not necessarily, again, because they're trying to get high. They might be trying to avoid withdrawal. Next, Tiffany, thank you so much for being here. In your experience, are kids with disabilities more isolated and therefore more vulnerable to drug use? What can we do to increase their community involvement if they are often rejected? I think that it depends, right? So I think that it depends on how invested parents are with their students with disabilities, and maybe the level of the disability, right? Because someone who's on the autism spectrum, who has pretty significant delays, might be more isolated than someone who has anxiety, where you can't necessarily see the disability. They might be more integrated into society. But yes, isolation, of course, is the opposite of connection, and connection is the antidote to drug use. So yes, isolation does make someone more vulnerable to misusing substances. And then part 2 of that question was, what can we do to increase their community involvement if they are often rejected? I think that goes back to the other slide, right? So look for things that support your child. I don't know the age of your child, but looking for like I have a friend who has a child with cerebral palsy. And she takes him everywhere. When we visited them in Seattle, we went to the top of the, I forgot what the Seattle little structure is called, but we rode him right up there with us. Like everything that her other 2 children do with her husband, we all do together. So it's literally including them in everything and looking for sites and events that have adaptations to meet their needs. Another question was, how does treatment of ADHD with non-stimulant medications figure into substance use disorder risk? That sounds like a conversation for the psychiatrist, because I don't have that answer. So talk with the Space Needle, thank you. So talk with your prescribing physician. And then there was one comment. I watched your talk with the FCPS PRC back in early March. And I believe you said Narcan was rolled out to all schools, and now I'm happy to hear it is available at all schools now, and we've trained people to administer. Narcan has been in our buildings since November. Every single building, elementary, middle, and high schools, has been well stocked since November. And we do our monthly checks every single month since November. And all of the admin and the people listed have been trained since the beginning of the school year. Any other questions? If parents.
Hey, Tiffany, it's Michelle.
Uh-huh.
I just want to jump in response to Kate's question about the non-stimulant medications. I am not a psychiatrist and I don't play one on this webinar, but I have taken a few continuing ed classes in my mental health training. And from my understanding, and again, speak with your physician, it's really about looking at that impulsivity piece and also kind of slowing things down. So if it would seem to me that if somebody has ADHD and their symptoms are being controlled by the non-stimulants, that's a step in the right direction. But like Tiffany said, definitely speak with your prescribing physician.
Thank you, Michelle. Another question, if parents should not offer alcohol to their teens, how should we prepare kids for alcohol use and parties in college? Conversations. Conversations about what college looks like, conversations about when young people use alcohol, they're not trying to have a nice cocktail or a little glass of wine to take the edge off. They're drinking to get drunk. They're binge drinking, right? So talking about BAC, blood alcohol concentration in the body, what it looks like, how to be a responsible person in the room when it looks like someone is drinking a little bit too much, how they should call 911 when someone is passed out drunk, because I'd rather have an alive friend who's angry with me than a dead friend. Any other questions? If not, I think we can wrap up.
So Tiffany, thank you so much for this information. I've also seen many of your presentations in the past, and I love the extra information that you put in about ADHD and autism, and those IEP memes were actually spot on. So well done. I know you did a lot of research to really add to tailor to our population. So I wanted to say thank you again for that. Anybody else have any other questions? You're also welcome to unmute and just ask if so. Tiffany is a wealth of knowledge. Well, I can encourage you as a parent, for sure, reach out to her when the program ends, and then you think of your question in 20 minutes. She's very receptive and we'll get back to you, I would imagine, pretty quickly. Anything else, Tiffany, that you want to add?
Nope, that's all for me. I'll stop sharing my screen now and log off.
Fantastic. Thank you so much again for joining us this evening. I'm glad you got your power nap in today. I tried, but my dog wouldn't let me. So just to wrap up our final pieces of business here, the ACSD, the Advisory Committee for Students with Disabilities, is meeting on May 10th at 7 o'clock at Willow Oaks in room 1000 B as in boy. Public comment can be submitted by email at acsdchair fcps.edu. And again, the ACSC is the Advisory Committee for Students with Disabilities. And our SEPTA Awards ceremony, I believe Lauren has put the link in the chat, is on Saturday, May 6th at 7 p.m. Please do RSVP so that we know how many people to expect. If there's anything else anyone else wants to chime in or turn on their camera about, you're more than welcome to do so. Otherwise, thank you all for joining us this evening. And if you're watching the recording, thank you for tuning in as well. I'm going to stop the recording.
Excellent meeting, excellent presentation. I enjoy attending. Sorry that